The morning sun bled through the heavy crimson velvet curtains, casting a bruised golden light across the sprawling expanse of Don Alessandro's private chambers. For the first time in 3 months, I didn't wake up to the bitter cold of the servants' quarters, or the harsh barking orders of Madame Rossi. Instead, I woke to the stifling, heady heat of the most dangerous man in the city. Alessandro's heavy, muscular arm was draped possessively across my waist, pinning my back flush against the hard, warm plane of his chest. Even in sleep, his grip was an iron vice, a silent subconscious warning to the rest of the world that I belonged to him. The rhythm of his breathing was deep and perfectly measured, vibrating against my spine. The rich scent of expensive bergamot, aged cedar, and the faint musky perfume of our shared night wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I lay completely still, terrified that even the slightest shift of my weight would break the fragile, impossible illusion of this morning. Yesterday, I was Elara, the disgraced daughter of a traitor, forced to scrub imported marble floors until my knees bled to pay off an unforgivable debt. Last night, I became something else entirely, as my eyes traced the intricate, jagged lines of the dark syndicate tattoo curling over his thick shoulder and disappearing beneath the silk sheets. A profound, terrifying realization settled over me. I had surrendered my innocence to the monster who had orchestrated my family's ruin. And God help me, I didn't regret a single second of it. I was entirely unmoored. The fierce, desperate way he had worshipped me in the dark had shattered every defense I possessed, but the stark light of day brought the crushing weight of reality crashing back down. I was still trapped in a gilded cage. Outside these heavy double doors, an entire empire of ruthless men still viewed me as nothing more than dirt beneath their polished shoes. Slowly, agonizingly, I tested the restraint of his arm. He murmured something low and rough in his sleep, his brow furrowing slightly, but his grip loosened just enough for me to slip from the heat of the mattress. The shock of the cool morning air against my bare skin made me shiver violently. I stood beside the massive bed, my legs trembling as I looked down at the lethal, beautiful man sleeping amidst the tangled silk. He looked like a fallen king, completely relaxed, entirely unguarded, a privilege no one else in his violent world had ever witnessed. My eyes darted across the room, landing on the humiliating pile of gray wool resting near the edge of the Persian rug, my maid's uniform, the stark reminder of exactly what I was. I practically crawled toward it, pulling the coarse, scratchy fabric over my head and trembling as my fingers navigated the stiff plastic buttons. Putting the uniform back on felt like stepping back into my chains, but the ingrained terror of being caught out of line was a habit too deep to break. Alessandro had claimed me in the shadows, but my mind was still utterly conditioned to survive the daylight. If a capo or a guard walked through those doors and found me in the Don's bed, they would execute me before Alessandro even had the chance to wake up. I needed to leave before the estate began to stir. I crept toward the heavy carved doors, my bare feet silent against the marble. With trembling fingers, I gripped the brass deadbolt we had thrown together the night before. It yielded with a quiet, oiled click. I cast one final, longing look at the man who now owned my soul, pulled the door open just wide enough to slip my body through, and vanished into the freezing cold of the morning. The labyrinth of the Valerius mansion was dead quiet at this hour, filled only with the lingering shadows of night watchmen. I navigated the back stairwells like a ghost, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs, until I finally pushed open the peeling wooden door of my assigned quarters. It wasn't a room, it was a cell. Damp stone walls, a single frosted window near the ceiling, and a rusted iron cot that squeaked in protest as I collapsed onto the thin mattress. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in my hands. My entire body ached with a dull, unfamiliar soreness, every muscle humming with the phantom brand of Alessandro's touches. The coarse wool of my uniform rubbed harshly against the sensitive skin of my collarbones, exactly where his lips had burned away my fears just hours ago. A choked sob tore from my throat. I had lost my innocence, the most precious, fragile piece of myself, the only thing I truly owned, had been given to the Don of the syndicate. I wasn't weeping out of regret. I was weeping because I knew the taste of heaven, and I was sitting in hell. He had treated me like a secret queen, whispering dark, beautiful promises against my skin. But in this miserable, freezing room, I was nothing but the traitor's daughter all over again. I wiped the tears fiercely from my cheeks, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, gray pre-dawn light filtering through the tiny window. The cruel irony of my punishment had never felt heavier. When I was brought to the estate to pay for my father's crimes, Madame Rossi had intentionally assigned me to this exact room. This was where my father, Thomas Vance, had lived during his years working as a bookkeeper for the Valerius family. I was sleeping on the same rusted springs, staring at the same cracked ceiling he had stared at before they dragged him down to the basement and executed him for embezzlement. As I shifted to reach for my scuffed work shoes, the heel of my boot caught against the uneven stone flooring beneath the iron bed frame. I paused, frowning. I knelt on the freezing ground, running my fingers over the chilled stone. One of the rectangular blocks felt loose, the mortar around it completely scraped away. My breath hitched. It was a hiding spot. Only someone who lived in this specific miserable cell would ever notice it. With desperate, trembling fingers, I pried the heavy stone loose and slid it aside. Inside the dark hollow lay a small, frayed leather journal. I pulled it out, bringing it up to the weak light of the window. The initials TV were embossed into the cracked spine. My father. My lungs seized as I opened the brittle pages. The frantic, jagged handwriting was unmistakably his, but the words were a descent into madness and terror. He hadn't been stealing money to pay off gambling debts like the capos had claimed. He had been tracking a shadow. According to the ledger, a massive amount of untraceable weapons and syndicate funds were being siphoned, but not by my father. As my eyes scanned the final hurried entry, the blood in my veins turned to pure ice. He knows I found the discrepancies. Rocco knows. Rocco, Alessandro's underboss, the massive stone-faced right-hand man who stood by the Don's side at every meeting, the man who commanded the elite guards. The journal detailed a chilling decades-old vendetta. Years ago, during a brutal territorial war led by Alessandro's father, a stray bullet from a Valerius gun had shattered a bakery window, killing a young woman named Elena. She was Rocco's fiancée. The syndicate had written it off as collateral damage, but Rocco had never forgiven the bloodline. He had spent 15 years bearing his grief, playing the loyal soldier, rising through the ranks until he became the Don's most trusted brother-in-arms. He was positioning himself to take the entire empire from the inside out, waiting for the perfect moment to put a bullet in Alessandro's head. My father had uncovered the coup, and before he could bring the evidence to Alessandro, Rocco had framed him for the missing money and ordered his execution to bury the truth. The journal slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The man who had ruined my life, the man who had ordered my father's death, was the same man standing guard outside Alessandro's door. The sickening realization hit me like a physical blow. The Don was asleep, completely vulnerable, trusting his life to the very monster who had been planning to slaughter him for over a decade. And I was the only person in the world who knew. Just as the terrifying weight of the truth crashed over me, the shrill, echoing chime of the servant's bell rang through the corridors. The morning shift had begun. I shoved the brittle leather journal deep into the hidden pocket of my coarse wool apron, my hands trembling so violently I could barely smooth down the fabric. The shrill metallic clatter of the servant's bell, echoing through the damp stone corridors, signaled the start of the morning shift. I splashed freezing water from the rusted basin onto my face, desperate to wash away the exhaustion and the sheer panic swimming in my eyes. I had to play the part. I had to be nothing more than Elara, the disgraced maid, while holding the power to detonate the entire syndicate. The sprawling estate kitchen was a hive of hushed, frantic activity when I slipped through the swinging doors. Without Madame Rossi's tyrannical barking, a heavy, nervous energy hung over the stainless steel prep tables. The senior staff moved like ghosts, terrified of breathing wrong, terrified that the Don's sudden, invisible wrath would strike them next. I joined them, keeping my head bowed as I grabbed a polishing cloth, but my mind was entirely consumed by the leather-bound ghost resting heavy against my hip. Then the rhythmic, heavy thud of combat boots silenced the room. Rocco. The temperature in the kitchen instantly plummeted. I gripped the edge of the marble counter, my knuckles turning bone white. Before today, I had only seen the towering underboss as Alessandro's loyal shadow, a massive, stone-faced mountain of muscle who guarded the Don with ruthless efficiency. Now, looking at him through the terrifying veil of my father's final words, I saw the monster hiding in plain sight. I saw the man who had orchestrated my family's ruin, executed my father, and spent 15 years plotting the murder of his own king over a stray bullet. Rocco stood perfectly still by the arched doorway, his dark, dead eyes scanning the terrified kitchen staff. He looked completely composed, the absolute picture of a dedicated lieutenant. He wore a tailored black suit that strained against his broad shoulders, radiating a cold, calculated authority that made my stomach churn. The hypocrisy of his presence was sickening. When his hollow gaze slowly swept over me, a violent jolt of adrenaline spiked through my veins. I forced myself to stare blankly at the floor. Did he know? Did he suspect that the disposable daughter of the man he framed had just spent the night walked in the Don's embrace? "The boss's espresso," Rocco commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. "Prepare it. The girl takes it up." He didn't even use my name. To him, I was merely an object. A convenient, pathetic pawn placed perfectly in the center of his decades-old vendetta. An older cook, her hands shaking visibly, rushed to the expensive espresso machine. She carefully placed the delicate porcelain saucer onto a polished silver tray, adding a tiny silver spoon and a crisp linen napkin. She practically shoved the tray into my hands, desperate to retreat from the underboss's suffocating aura. I took the silver tray, the metal feeling as heavy as a tombstone. Rocco stepped aside just enough to let me pass, but as I walked by him, the chilling scent of his aftershave mixed with the metallic tang of my own fear. "Do not keep him waiting," Rocco murmured, the words laced with a dark, subtle edge that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I pushed through the swinging doors and began the long, agonizing walk down the grand corridors of the West Wing. Every step felt like a march toward a cliff's edge, my reflection warped in the polished silver of the tray, capturing the pale, terrified face of a woman caught in a lethal crossfire. The physical weight of the porcelain in my hands was nothing compared to the psychological weight of the journal bumping rhythmically against my thigh with every stride. I had to warn him. I had to walk into the lion's den, look the most terrifying man in the underworld in the eye, and shatter his reality by telling him his brother-in-arms was a snake. As the heavy, imposing mahogany doors finally loomed at the end of the forbidden hallway, my breath hitched. I was about to walk back into the sanctuary of the man who had branded my soul. Seeing him, I don't know how I will feel. The heavy brass handle yielded under my trembling fingers with a soft, oiled click. Pushing the mahogany doors open, I stepped out of the freezing, hostile corridors of the estate and back into the suffocating warmth of Don Alessandro's sanctuary. The transition was jarring. Out there, I was prey. In here, surrounded by the rich, intoxicating scent of aged cedar and sharp bergamot, I was the sole obsession of the apex predator. Alessandro was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the sprawling grounds of his empire. He had dressed in a pair of dark, tailored trousers and a crisp white shirt, though it hung open, the fabric teasing the edges of the lethal, jagged ink carved into his chest. The morning sunlight caught the sharp, aristocratic lines of his profile, making him look like a beautiful, merciless god carved from marble. My heart slammed against my ribs. The silver tray rattled slightly in my grip, the porcelain cup clinking against the saucer. I rehearsed the words in my mind. A frantic, desperate chant. Rocco is the traitor. My father was framed. They are coming for you. My free hand twitched toward the deep pocket of my wool apron, my fingertips brushing the frayed leather edge of the hidden journal. I needed to show him the proof. I needed to shatter his trust in his underboss before it was too late. At the faint sound of the rattling china, Alessandro turned. The moment his stormy ocean eyes locked onto mine, every single rational thought in my head evaporated into thin air. The cold, calculating mask of the Don vanished, replaced instantly by a dark, consuming hunger that made my breath catch in my throat. He didn't say a word. He crossed the vast expanse of the room with the slow, predatory grace of a man who owned every inch of the ground he walked on. I opened my mouth to speak, to warn him, but the sheer magnetic pull of his presence paralyzed my vocal cords. He stopped mere inches from me, the suffocating heat of his towering frame washing over my chilled skin. Without breaking eye contact, his large, ringed hands reached out and took the silver tray from my trembling grip. He set it carelessly onto the edge of his massive desk, dismissing the espresso entirely. "You came back," he murmured, his voice a dark, velvety rumble that vibrated through the soles of my shoes and settled heavy in my stomach. Alessandro, I have to tell you," I stammered, my hand moving toward my apron pocket again. "Shh," he whispered, stepping fully into my space. He didn't let me finish. His large hands moved to my face, his calloused thumbs gently tracing the line of my jaw, before sliding back to tangle in my hair. He tilted my head up, forcing me to drown in the fierce, blinding reverence of his gaze. "The estate doesn't exist inside this room, Elara. Not when I am looking at you." He leaned down, and the moment his lips captured mine, the world outside the mahogany doors ceased to spin. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate and possessive and dripping with an addictive heat that completely overrode my survival instincts. A soft gasp broke from my throat, and he swallowed the sound, his strong arms wrapping around my waist to pull my stomach flush against his hard torso. The coarse gray wool of my uniform rubbed against the fine silk of his open shirt, a beautiful, agonizing friction. My hands, which moments ago were desperate to reach for the ledger, instinctively flew up to clutch his broad shoulders. The journal sat heavy in my pocket, holding the secrets of his impending doom, but the fire igniting in my veins burned far hotter than my fear. How could I think of death and betrayal when he was kissing me as if I were the very oxygen in his lungs? He backed me slowly against the edge of the desk, his lips trailing blazing fire down the sensitive skin of my neck, right over my racing pulse. Every brush of his mouth, every low, ragged breath he took against my skin, melted my resolve into a puddle of absolute devotion. I was lost in him, wholly, terrifyingly lost. After a suspended eternity, Alessandro finally pulled back, resting his forehead against mine. We were both breathing heavily, the chaotic rhythm of our hearts beating in perfect sync. A wickedly beautiful, satisfied smile played at the corners of his lips as he looked down at my flushed cheeks and swollen lips. He had completely disarmed me without firing a single shot. "You make the morning bearable, little bird," he whispered, his thumb brushing my lower lip, one last time before he slowly stepped back, granting me the space I desperately needed to catch my breath. The haze of lust began to clear, the cold reality of the estate rushing back into my lungs. The journal, I blinked rapidly, my mind scrambling to retrieve the terrifying truth I had walked in here to deliver. I reached my trembling hand into my apron pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around the worn leather binding. "Alessandro," I gasped, my voice shaking with a sudden renewed urgency. "There is something you need to see. It's about Rocco. But my words died in the air. Alessandro had turned his back to me for a fraction of a second to pick up the porcelain cup from the silver tray. He took a long, casual sip of the dark espresso. Before I could pull the diary from my pocket, his hand froze in midair. The delicate cup slipped from his grasp, shattering against the imported marble floor with a violent, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot. The dark liquid splattered across the toes of his polished shoes, He didn't scream, he simply staggered backward, his massive hands flying to his throat as a terrifying, unnatural wheeze tore from his chest. The color completely drained from his face, his stormy eyes widening in sheer paralyzing shock as his knees buckled beneath him. I was confused, and then I started screaming for help. Help! Help! The heavy mahogany doors burst open before the echo of my voice could even fade. Rocco surged into the sanctuary, a dozen armed elite guards flooding in behind him. The underboss took in the scene in a fraction of a second, the shattered cup, the Don gasping on the floor, and the disgraced maid hovering over him with trembling hands. A dark, triumphant gleam flashed in Rocco's hollow eyes before he perfectly masked it with manufactured outrage. "Seize her," Rocco roared, drawing his weapon and aiming it squarely at my chest. "The traitor's daughter poisoned the Don. Get her in chains and drag her down to the holding cells." Two massive guards lunged forward, their rough hands violently gripping my arms, hauling me away from Alessandro. I thrashed against their hold, tears streaming down my face as I watched the man I loved fighting for air. "No," I sobbed, the coarse wool of my uniform tearing as I struggled. "I didn't do it. Please, you have to save him." Rocco ignored my pleas, gesturing sharply toward the corridor. But before the guards could drag me over the threshold, a low guttural snarl vibrated from the floor. "Let her go!" The command was barely a raspy whisper, stripped of its usual velvet resonance, but it hit the room with the force of an explosive. Every man froze. Alessandro was on his knees, his muscles straining as he fought the venom ravaging his bloodstream. He lifted his heavy head, his ocean eyes locking onto Rocco with a terrifying, unyielding promise of death. "If your men take one more step with her, I will carve their hearts out. Summon the private physician immediately." Rocco's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek as his perfect execution plan hit a wall of pure, stubborn willpower. He gave a sharp nod, and the guards instantly released me. I collapsed onto the floor, my lungs burning as we waited in agonizing, suffocating tension. Within minutes, the estate's private doctor rushed through the doors, his medical bag clattering against the marble. The physician dropped to his knees beside the Don, his hands moving frantically as he checked Alessandro's plummeting pulse and the discoloration of his skin. The doctor pulled a small vial from his kit, administering a swift injection into Alessandro's neck to stabilize his heart rate. "It is a fast-acting paralytic neurotoxin," the doctor announced, his voice trembling as he looked up at the circle of armed men. "Ingested." If he hadn't possessed such immense physical tolerance, his heart would have stopped 2 minutes ago. The silence in the room became lethal. Every single eye slowly turned toward me. The hatred in the air was thick enough to choke on. I was the maid who served the cup. I was the daughter of the man who stole from them. In their eyes, my guilt was absolute. Rocco stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "The proof is right here, boss. Let me take her down to the basement. I will make her confess to who supplied the toxin." Alessandro braced his arm against the edge of the heavy desk, slowly forcing himself up until he was sitting against the mahogany wood. He was pale and sweating, but the ruthless king was still entirely in command. He looked at Rocco, then at the doctor, and finally, his gaze settled on my terrified, tear-stained face. He knew, even with poison in his veins, he knew I would never hurt him. "Get out," Alessandro ordered, his breathing shallow but his tone leaving no room for argument. "All of you, the maid stays here." Rocco stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Don Valerius, she is a lethal threat. It isn't safe." "I said get out," Alessandro roared, the effort draining the last bit of color from his face. "She is my prisoner. I will interrogate her myself. Lock these doors from the outside and post guards. No one enters until I have my answers." He ordered the doctor to get the antidote for the poison. The heavy brass deadbolt slid into place with a resounding metallic thud, sealing us inside the sanctuary. The chaotic shouting of Rocco and the elite guards was instantly muffled, leaving only the ragged sound of Alessandro's breathing. The private physician, trembling uncontrollably, knelt beside the Don. He reached into a hidden, zippered compartment at the bottom of his leather medical bag and pulled out a secondary vial filled with a clear, iridescent amber liquid. "The antidote, Don Valerius," the doctor whispered frantically, his hands shaking as he prepared the syringe. "It will bind to the neurotoxin and flush it from your system within the hour. The paralysis will fade, but the pain will be severe." Alessandro didn't flinch as the needle pierced the thick vein in his neck. Almost instantly, a sharp, violent shudder wrecked his massive frame. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands hovering uselessly over his chest, terrified to touch him, but unable to pull away. Slowly, the sickly gray pallor of his skin began to recede, replaced by a flush of returning blood. The lethal, suffocating grip of the poison was breaking. As the physician packed away his syringe, Alessandro's hand shot out with terrifying speed. His large fingers clamped around the doctor's collar, yanking the older man downward until they were inches apart. The Don's stormy ocean eyes were blazing with a cold, calculated fury. "Listen to me very carefully," Alessandro commanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "When you walk out that mahogany door, you will tell my underboss that the toxin is still ravaging my organs. You will tell him the injection merely bought me time, but that I am fading fast. You will sell the lie that I am weak, bedridden, and dying." The doctor swallowed hard, his eyes wide with sheer panic. But boss, if they think you are defenseless, if Rocco knows his boss is dying, he will slaughter the whole world to get the person behind this," Alessandro interrupted, the absolute certainty in his tone sending a violent chill down my spine. "My recovery is a ghost. It does not exist outside these walls. If my underboss finds out otherwise, I will know exactly who whispered it to him. Do you understand?" "Yes, Don Valerius, not a word," the physician stammered. Alessandro released him, and the terrified doctors scurried to the doors, knocking twice to be let out. The moment the guards opened the doors to retrieve him, I saw Rocco's imposing shadow lingering in the corridor. Then the heavy wood slammed shut again, the deadbolt clicking back into place. We were entirely alone. Alessandro leaned his head back against the carved leg of his desk, closing his eyes as a groan of raw agony vibrated in his chest. The antidote was warring with the poison, tearing through his veins. I couldn't hold back anymore. I crawled across the imported rug and threw my arms around his broad shoulders, burying my face in the crook of his neck. His skin was burning hot, covered in a sheer layer of sweat, but his thick arms instantly came up to encircle my waist, pulling me flush against his hammering heart. "You're going to be okay," I sobbed quietly into his crisp white shirt. "You have to be okay." "I am not dying today, little bird," he murmured, resting his heavy chin on the top of my head. "But my enemies need to believe I am. It is the only way to draw the rats out of the shadows." I pulled back slightly, looking down into his exhausted but fiercely intelligent eyes. The trap he was setting was brilliant, but he was missing the most crucial piece of the puzzle. He was preparing to hunt blindly, not knowing that the rat was the very man guarding his door. My trembling fingers reached into the deep pocket of my coarse wool apron. I pulled out the frayed brittle leather diary. "You don't have to hunt them, Alessandro," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I pressed the old ledger directly into his calloused palm. "I already know who poured the poison." He frowned, staring down at the embossed initials on the cover. TV, the realization of what he was holding shifted the energy in the room entirely. "I found it this morning," I explained, the words tumbling out in a desperate, frantic rush. "Hidden under a loose stone in my quarters. The same room you kept my father in 15 years ago. He wasn't stealing your money, Alessandro. He was balancing the books, and he found the discrepancy. He found out that Rocco has been siphoning weapons and loyalty for over a decade." Alessandro's entire body went rigid. The lingering pain of the poison was instantly eclipsed by the devastating shock of the betrayal. He opened the brittle pages, his eyes scanning my father's jagged, terrified handwriting. I watched the ruthless king absorb the truth. The stray bullet, the death of Rocco's fiancée Elena, and the 15-year vendetta that had culminated in this exact moment. When he reached the final entry, the entry where my father realized Rocco was going to frame him and execute him to bury the coup, Alessandro slowly closed the book. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the fiery, explosive rage of a Mafia boss. It was the absolute sub-zero calm of a man who had just decided to burn the world to ashes. Rocco, Alessandro breathed, the name slipping from his lips like a curse. He looked at the ledger, then slowly lifted his gaze to me. The realization of what I had suffered, the humiliation, the servitude, the loss of my father, all orchestrated by his own right-hand man, struck him with physical force. He reached up, his large hands gently framing my face. His thumbs wiped away the fresh tears spilling over my cheeks. He framed your bloodline to protect his treason. He made you a slave in my house. And today, he tried to make you the scapegoat for my murder. If you hadn't ordered them out, I whispered, my voice cracking, Rocco would have dragged me down to the basement. He would have killed me to tie up the loose ends. Alessandro's jaw locked, a dangerous, possessive fire igniting in the stormy depths of his eyes. With a sudden surge of returning strength, he shifted his weight, pulling me entirely into his lap. He wrapped his arms around me with a fierce, unbreakable grip, burying his face in my neck as he inhaled the scent of my skin. He is never going to touch you, Alessandro vowed, his voice a dark, vibrating rumble against my collarbone. As long as the house thinks I am dying, Rocco controls the estate, which means stepping outside these mahogany doors is a death sentence for you. You are to stay in this room, Elara. You do not leave my sight for a single second. We stay locked inside the sanctuary until my strength returns, and then... He lifted his head, his expression carved from pure, lethal ice. Then, I am going to show my underboss exactly why they call me a monster. The adrenaline that had fueled Alessandro through the physician's visit and the devastating revelation of the ledger suddenly evaporated. As he held me in his lap, the brutal reality of the antidote warring against the neurotoxin took its toll. A violent tremor racked his broad shoulders, and the burning heat radiating from his skin spiked into a dangerous, consuming fever. His grip around my waist slackened, his heavy head dropping forward to rest against my collarbone with an exhausted, ragged exhale. The ruthless, untouchable king of the underworld was crashing, and I was the only person left to catch him. "We need to get you off the floor," I urged, my voice a frantic whisper as I scrambled out of his lap. I grabbed his thick arm, wrapping it over my shoulders, bracing my entirely inadequate frame against his towering bulk. Alessandro didn't argue. The sheer fact that he allowed me to bear his weight spoke volumes of his agonizing condition. Together, we managed a clumsy, agonizingly slow stumble across the floor. By the time we reached the edge of the sprawling mattress, his legs gave out completely. He collapsed backward onto the tangled silk sheets, his chest heaving as a slick layer of feverish sweat coated his pale skin. Panic fluttered wildly in my chest, but I forced it down. I was no longer the trembling, disgraced servant shrinking into the wallpaper. I was the keeper of his secrets, the woman he had just claimed as his own. I hurried into the ensuite bathroom, soaking a thick plush towel in freezing water before rushing back to his side. His charcoal trousers were ruined with spilled espresso, and his crisp white dress shirt was clinging uncomfortably to his damp torso. My hands hovered over the mother-of-pearl buttons. Just hours ago, he had commanded me to dress him, a terrifying exercise in absolute power and submission. Now, as I carefully unfastened the silk to strip the ruined fabric from his shoulders, the intimacy was entirely different. It wasn't about control. It was an act of desperate, fiercely protective devotion. I pressed the ice-cold towel against his burning forehead, earning a low, gravelly groan of relief from deep within his chest. I traced the damp cloth over the sharp angles of his jaw, down the thick column of his neck, and across the intricate, jagged ink of the syndicate tattoo spreading over his pectoral. "I am sorry, but," Alessandro rasped. His eyes closed as he fought the internal war ravaging his organs. His large hand blindly sought mine, his calloused fingers wrapping weakly but securely around my wrist. "You have nothing to apologize for," I murmured, dipping the towel into a crystal bowl of cold water I had dragged to the bedside table. I wrung it out, applying it to his fevered chest. "You are fighting off a lethal dose of venom. Just rest." "Not for the poison," he corrected, his stormy eyes slowly fluttering open. The intensity in his gaze was blinding, cutting through the haze of his fever. He looked at me, truly looked at me, taking in my scuffed shoes, the coarse, scratchy wool of my maid's uniform, and the dark circles of exhaustion bruising the skin under my eyes. "I am apologizing for the 15 years your family spent in disgrace, for the floors you scrubbed in this house. Rocco used my authority as a weapon to execute an innocent man, and I was too blind to see the snake coiled at my own right hand. I failed you, Elara, long before you ever walked through these mahogany doors." The raw, unfiltered guilt in his voice shattered my heart. The most dangerous man in the city, a Don who answered to absolutely no one, was asking for absolution from a lowly maid. "You didn't know," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. I shifted closer, intertwining my fingers with his, pressing his knuckles against my lips. "Rocco orchestrated an invisible war, but my father's sacrifice wasn't for nothing. He left the truth behind, and it found its way back to us. We are going to survive this, Alessandro. You are going to survive this." Before he could answer, the heavy, suffocating silence of the sanctuary was shattered by the sound of heavy knuckles rapping sharply against the thick mahogany of the double doors. We both froze. The tender, vulnerable bubble we had built around the bed instantly hardened into a fortress of ice. Alessandro's jaw locked, the muscles in his arms instantly coiling with tension despite the fever. "Boss!" Rocco's muffled, gravelly voice bled through the heavy wood. It was perfectly modulated to sound respectful, masking the lethal, calculating intent beneath. "The capos are gathering in the war room. The estate is secure, but the men are restless. They are demanding a status report on your condition. Should I tell them their Don is recovering, or should I prepare the succession protocols?" The sheer audacity of the question made my blood run cold. He wasn't checking on his friend. He was testing the waters. He was trying to determine if the poison had finished its work, eager to claim the empty throne. Alessandro's grip on my hand tightened painfully. He looked at me, a silent command passing between us. He needed to play the part of the dying king perfectly to keep the underboss confident and unaware of the trap. Alessandro drew in a shallow, rattling breath, forcing his voice to sound incredibly weak, raspy, and entirely broken. Tell them nothing yet, Rocco," he choked out, coughing violently for added effect. "The physician, his injection did little. I cannot stand." A chilling, heavy silence stretched from the corridor. I could practically picture the underboss standing on the other side of the threshold, a wicked, victorious smile twisting his stone-cold features. "Understood, Don Valerius," Rocco finally replied, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Conserve your strength. I will take command of the men and manage the estate until the inevitable conclusion. You just rest. I have everything under control." The heavy thud of Rocco's combat boots echoed as he walked away, leaving us sealed inside our gilded cage. Alessandro released a long, slow exhale, the manufactured weakness instantly vanishing from his eyes, replaced by a dark, unholy fire. "He just claimed the throne," Alessandro whispered, a slow, terrifying smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. He pulled my hand down, pressing it flat against his chest, right over the steady, powerful thrum of his healing heart. Let him wear the crown for a few more hours. Let him feel invincible, because when the sun sets, my little bird, we are going to burn his entire kingdom to the ground. Come sleep beside me, please. I need you right now," Alessandro whispered, pulling me beside him. I love the sound of that, so I didn't hesitate. The grandfather clock in the far corner of the sanctuary struck 8, its deep, resonant chime swallowed by the suffocating darkness of the room. We had not dared to turn on a single lamp. To the traitors pacing the corridors outside, the pitch-black silence behind the mahogany doors was the ultimate proof that their king was fading into the void. But inside the pitch-black room, the reality was entirely different. The fever had finally broken. I sat near the edge of the mattress, my legs pulled tight to my chest as my eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight filtering through the towering windows. Alessandro stood across the room, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal figure against the glass. The agonizing tremors were gone. The poison had been completely flushed from his veins, leaving behind a cold, coiled energy that practically crackled in the quiet air. He rolled his broad shoulders, the intricate ink of his syndicate tattoo shifting fluidly under the pale light. The wounded man I had nursed for hours had vanished. The apex predator of the Valerius Empire was fully restored, and his silence was deafening. He turned away from the window, his bare feet making no sound against the imported rug, as he approached the towering bookshelves lining the eastern wall. He reached behind a leather-bound encyclopedia, pressing a hidden mechanism I couldn't see. With a quiet hydraulic hiss, an entire section of the heavy oak shelving swung inward, revealing a hidden, steel-reinforced armory built directly into the foundation. My breath hitched. The faint smell of gun oil mingled with the familiar scent of cedar and bergamot. Alessandro didn't hesitate. He pulled a fresh-tailored black shirt from a hidden compartment, slipping it over his broad shoulders before reaching for his weapons. The metallic, rhythmic click-clack of a magazine sliding into a custom handgun echoed in the dark. It was the sound of an impending execution. "Come here, Elara," he commanded softly, his voice a smooth, dark rumble that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I slid off the bed, my coarse wool skirt brushing my calves as I crossed the room to stand beside him. He reached into the steel vault, bypassing the heavier artillery, and withdrew a sleek, compact silver pistol. He checked the chamber with practiced mechanical precision before turning to face me. Gently, he took my trembling right hand, placing the cold, heavy metal directly into my palm. His large fingers curled my hand around the grip, locking my finger just outside the trigger guard. "Alessandro, I can't," I whispered, panic rising in my throat as the weight of the weapon dragged my hand down. "I have never fired a gun. I will miss. I will hurt you." "You won't have to fire it," he murmured, stepping closer until the heat of his body banished the chill of the metal. He cupped the back of my neck, his thumb stroking my pulse point with a fierce, grounding tenderness. "But I need to know you are armed. Rocco controls the hallway, which means I cannot walk out the front door without stepping into a firing squad. I am going to use the servants' passage behind this vault to flank them from the east wing. I will be a ghost in my own house." The brilliance of his strategy hit me. Rocco was guarding a locked door, completely unaware that his prey was about to materialize directly behind him. But the realization also meant Alessandro was leaving the sanctuary. He was going to wage a one-man war against his own elite guards. "You are going alone," I choked out, my free hand gripping the crisp fabric of his dark shirt. The thought of losing him now, after surviving the poison, was unbearable. There are a dozen men out there, Rocco's most loyal soldiers. "Loyalty bought with lies crumbles the second the truth steps out of the shadows," Alessandro replied, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He looked down at me, the affection in his eyes burning brighter than the moonlight. "And I am not just fighting for my empire anymore, little bird. I am fighting to avenge the man who died in my basement 15 years ago. I am fighting to ensure that no one in this city ever looks at you with disrespect again." He leaned down, capturing my lips in a kiss that tasted of absolute, devastating finality. It was a promise of violence and a vow of protection, all tangled into one breathless moment. When he finally pulled away, he guided me toward the ensuite bathroom, stepping back and pulling the heavy reinforced oak door shut between us. "Lock it from the inside," his voice filtered through the wood, echoing with lethal authority. "Do not open it for anyone except me. If you hear Rocco's voice, shoot straight through the center of the door." I turned the brass lock, my hand shaking violently as the final click sealed me in the pitch-black space. I pressed my back against the cold tiles, clutching the silver pistol to my chest, and listened. The cold porcelain of the bathtub pressed rigidly against my spine, grounding me in the pitch-black isolation of the ensuite. Every breath I took felt deafening, amplified by the suffocating silence of the locked bathroom. The silver pistol in my grip was a heavy, freezing anchor, pulling me completely out of the subservient world I had known, and thrusting me into the violent reality of the Valerius Empire. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind replaying the intoxicating heat of Alessandro's parting kiss, using the memory as a shield against the creeping terror. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Then the absolute quiet of the estate shattered. It didn't begin with a chaotic roar or the explosive blast of a shotgun. It started with the terrifying, rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire, echoing from the grand corridor. The acoustics of the vaulted ceilings carried the heavy, sickening thud of massive bodies hitting the imported marble. Men were shouting, their voices laced with a sudden, primal panic. They had been guarding a door, waiting for their king to die, completely unaware that the Reaper had materialized directly behind their flank. "Form up, he's in the hall." The gravelly roar belonged to Rocco, but the manufactured stone-cold composure of the underboss was completely gone, replaced by frantic desperation. The chaos escalated, moving closer to the double doors. I could hear the desperate scramble of combat boots, the chaotic clatter of dropped magazines, and the brutal, visceral sounds of close-quarters combat. Alessandro wasn't just clearing the hallway. He was dismantling the traitors with his bare hands, executing a flawless, merciless vengeance. The sheer, untamed violence happening just yards away made the floorboards beneath me vibrate. Suddenly, a massive weight slammed against the already splintered mahogany doors of the bedroom. The wood groaned and finally gave way with a catastrophic crack, crashing inward. Heavy, uneven footsteps surged into the sanctuary. "Boss, where are you?" Rocco barked, his breathing ragged and uneven. He was trapped. The hallway was a slaughterhouse, and his only instinct was to secure leverage. He needed the hostage. He needed the maid. Through the thin crack beneath the bathroom door, a beam of harsh, tactical flashlight swept across the dark bedroom floor. I watched the beam illuminate the discarded, ruined silk of Alessandro's poisoned shirt, and then dart toward the massive, tangled bed. "The bed is empty," another guard yelled, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Rocco, the Don isn't here. It's a trap." "Shut up and find the girl," Rocco snarled, his heavy boots stomping across the Persian rug. "If he is alive, she is our only way out of this house." The beam of light snapped away from the mattress and tracked directly toward the ensuite. The heavy footsteps stopped just inches from the reinforced oak separating us. My heart hammered a frantic, blinding rhythm against my ribs. I raised the silver pistol, my trembling hands gripping the cold metal with every ounce of strength I possessed. I leveled the barrel squarely at the center of the wooden panel, exactly where a man's chest would be. "I know you're in there, little bird," Rocco mocked, his voice a sinister, breathless hiss slipping through the cracks of the door. He jiggled the brass handle. Finding it locked, he slammed his fist against the wood. "Open this door. If you make me shoot the lock off, I'm going to make you suffer exactly like your pathetic, thieving father did." The mention of Thomas Vance didn't paralyze me with fear. It did the exact opposite. A sudden burning clarity washed over my panic, igniting a fierce, protective rage I didn't know I was capable of. This was the monster who had framed my bloodline. This was the snake who had poured poison into the cup of the man who worshipped me. "Don Alessandro told me not to open the door for anyone," I replied, my voice shockingly steady, projecting clearly through the oak. I slid my index finger inside the trigger guard, bracing my feet against the tiled floor. Rocco let out a dark, cruel laugh. "Alessandro is bleeding out in a hallway. You have 3 seconds, girl. 1. I didn't wait for 2. I remembered the exact lethal command my Don had given me before he vanished into the shadows. If you hear Rocco's voice, shoot straight through the center of the door. I squeezed the trigger. The silver pistol bucked violently in my hands, a deafening roar erupting in the small bathroom as a muzzle flash illuminated the dark tiles. The bullet tore straight through the thick oak panel, splintering the wood outward. A sharp, agonizing grunt echoed from the other side, followed instantly by the heavy, satisfying thud of Rocco stumbling backward and hitting the bedroom floor. Before I could even lower the smoking barrel, a second, much louder sequence of gunfire erupted inside the bedroom. It wasn't my pistol. The remaining guards screamed, their voices abruptly silenced by a lethal, unparalleled precision. And then, total ringing silence. Elara! The voice on the other side of the door was not the gravelly sneer of the underboss. It was a dark, velvety rumble, heavy with exhaustion but vibrating with absolute, undeniable authority. It was my sanctuary. "Drop the weapon, little bird," Alessandro murmured softly through the bullet-pierced wood. "The hunt is over. Open the door." I didn't hesitate. I launched myself across the threshold. Before he could even speak, my hands tangled fiercely in the collar of his shirt, and I pulled his mouth down to mine. I kissed him passionately. It was a collision of love, adrenaline, and overwhelming relief. I kissed him with all the pent-up fear and blinding adoration I possessed, my lips parting eagerly under the intense, demanding heat of his. A raw, ragged groan vibrated deep in his chest. His thick arms instantly wrapped around my waist, hoisting me completely off the floor and crushing me against the solid, unbreakable wall of his body. "You're alive," I sobbed breathlessly against his lips, my fingers desperately tracing the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw to assure myself he was really there. I pressed my forehead against his, the frantic energy crashing through my veins, leaving me entirely unmoored. I needed to feel him. I needed to erase the violence of the night and replace it with the only thing that made sense anymore. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling with a raw, unfiltered need as I looked up into his blazing eyes. "Make love to me, Alessandro. Claim me completely. I surrender all of it to you." The absolute vulnerability of my plea struck him like a physical blow. The ruthless Mafia boss, the apex predator who had just dismantled a 15-year coup with his bare hands, looked down at me with an expression of profound, shattering reverence. The darkness in his gaze melted into a fierce, blinding devotion. He didn't answer with words. He carried me away from the ruin of the doorway, his strides long and purposeful, navigating through the shadows until he laid me gently against the tangled silk sheets of his massive bed. The violent world outside the shattered doors completely ceased to exist. Surrounded by the warmth of his skin and the intoxicating scent of bergamot, he worshipped every inch of me. His touches were a masterclass in possessive patience, completely entirely contrasting the brutal monster he had been moments ago in the hallway. He stripped away the coarse gray wool of my maid's uniform for the final time, treating the act like a sacred ritual, replacing the scratchy fabric with the burning, addictive heat of his lips. He traced the delicate lines of my collarbones, his mouth leaving a trail of fire that banished the lingering chill of my terror. I was no longer a disgraced servant paying off a debt. Under his intense, adoring gaze, I was priceless. When we finally came together, the absolute intensity of it stole the breath straight from my lungs. It was a forging of souls, a desperate claiming of the light after surviving the darkest night. I anchored myself to his broad shoulders, my fingers gripping the intricate ink of his syndicate tattoo, crying out his name as the pain and fear of my past were entirely consumed by a profound, overwhelming ecstasy. Hours later, the violent storm had finally passed. As the first rays of dawn pierced the heavy, crimson velvet curtains, casting a warm, golden veneration glow over the room, I lay resting peacefully against the hard plane of his chest. The rhythmic, steady thud of his heartbeat beneath my palm was the most beautiful sound in the world. Alessandro pressed a lingering, tender kiss to the crown of my head, his heavy arm wrapped securely around my waist like an iron shield. He shifted slightly, his callous thumb gently stroking my cheek. "The debt is erased, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low, sacred vow vibrating against my skin. "The ghosts of the past are buried. You are no longer a maid in this estate. You are the lady of this house." I looked up at him, a tear of pure, unadulterated happiness slipping over my lashes. I had walked into this room as a prisoner, and I was leaving it as an equal. "And when the sun fully rises," Alessandro continued, a wickedly beautiful, proud smile touching his lips as he pulled me closer, "the entire syndicate is going to learn to bow to their new queen."